Day. We're going to talk about fathers this morning. I was actually at West Allen whenever I delivered my first sermon. I studied with Dad in 2009, and some of you knew him and remember him, and he passed away at the end of that year. But in 2009, I preached my first sermon at West Allen, and then Melrose allowed me to come over and give a lesson because they learned that West Allen didn't close their doors because of me. He said, okay, we'll let him come preach one. And so I went over to Melrose to go preach my second sermon, and Dad couldn't make it. He was sick that morning. And so he still wrote a letter for me, and he gave it to David because he was living with David. Dad was a double amputee in a wheelchair, and I say that because that'll make sense because of what you're about to see. And he gave it to David to give to me. And so I received this before I preached Sunday morning. And this is very precious to me. You couldn't give me enough money for this. Dear Sean, it's about 6:30 a.m. right now. You're in or about to shower. There's so many things I wish to say to you that were not even in my mind 18 months ago. Did you imagine you would be where you are this morning? Especially saddened that I won't be there at Melrose because it seems more like your first time, though it is not. I'd preached once before. It sounds like I'm like a seasoned preacher. Remember this first. No one knows this sermon better than you. You chose this subject because you felt from your heart that many people needed its encouragement. This lesson gives scriptural guidance, forced insight to each living soul, and optimism for a better tomorrow. You're about to move apart from the world closer to God, Sean. Many brethren who had been plagued by worry are about to hear the good news concerning the ability to rest in the Lord. Couples who had previously been fighting over finances and other trivial matters will, for the first time, hear messages and a greater than this earth know. My spirit and encouragement will stand God's word with your brethren. Just look down that aisle toward the back, and you'll see my chariot with its brakes on, facing you in complete support. You need no other encouragement than that which Paul gave to Timothy, preach the word. So I charge you to fulfill your ministry. I love you with all my heart. Dad. And I love this because I realize that he's not the only one that has typos. So like father, like son, this is wonderful. This is a precious letter, something to treasure. It's a true treasure that I have that I wouldn't give to anyone in the world. We're thanking God today for good fathers, for godly fathers. Now every father, even the ones that we're going to look at this morning, if you look at them close enough, they disappoint. But there are good fathers and there are bad fathers nonetheless. And you see that in the Bible. Good fathers, bad fathers. We learn from them all. But ultimately, every good characteristic of a godly father originates with the Father of all light. Any good that you see in this world today originates from the fathers. Fathers who show, to their limited ability, part of the nature of God. Fathers who we'll talk about this morning, who build boats, who walk in the wilderness, and who sacrifice a son. This first individual you're very familiar with. We find out in Genesis chapter 5, verse 32, after Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, we learn from the text that God had numbered man 120 years, and it seems as you harmonize all the passages, that decision came before Noah fathered these sons. 500 years old. That's incredible. I sometimes just forget these little things. Yeah, he's 500 years old, and then he has boys. What ends up happening is God, he looks down and he's displeased with all his sons and daughters. Evil is on their minds continuously, and he has decided, I'm going to put an end to this except for 8. And so what he does is, you remember, He tells Noah what he's going to do. He gives him very specific instructions for the ark. And he lets him know destruction is coming except for you and your family. And he says, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. The flood comes. Noah is 600 years old when the floodwaters came upon the earth. So, brethren, whenever you put this together, what you learn is that God had numbered man's days. And then Noah, 500 years old, has these sons. Sometime between whenever Noah was 500 years old and he had sons, and then as you see here, he had wives. They had wives. He begins to build the ark. So sometime between that time and whenever he's 600 years old, he's building this boat on land. Fathers, God bless you whenever you build spiritual boats in your family. I'm not talking about physical boats. I'm not even talking about trying to pick a project to do with your kids, so there's wisdom in that. There's many good things that come with having a physical project with your kids. But I'm talking about building spiritual boats, if you will. A spiritual plan that you have in mind that comes from God, that takes time, that takes trust. God bless you whenever you do that. Your children are learning patience from you. And I would assume maybe that Noah and his sons were learning some patience together, even at 500 years old, during that time, because of what would happen over those several decades. And can you imagine what his sons perhaps would have felt like? I assume probably helped him build that boat. I don't know why they wouldn't. You ever felt like after day, year after year, decade after decade, they felt like it was futile and pointless, and began to think that, you know what, let's just stop. And there Noah was leading his boys year in and year out. They learned some patience from that man. There's something else that they learned. Hebrew writer says, by faith Noah, concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. Here's what I want you to join me in noticing this morning. It says that in reverent fear constructed an ark. God bless you, fathers, whenever you build boats based on God's blueprint, His design, because you are teaching your children authority. You are teaching your children respect for God. People who respect God and follow His blueprint are blessed. And children that do not know their God and do not respect authority curse a world that they live in. Build the boat in reverent fear and appreciation of your God. And we find out in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, now in context here, Peter is speaking about how the Lord knows how to both rescue and punish. And he gives an example of rescuing. He says, if he did not spare the ancient world but preserved Noah, and now here's something else we learned about. See, he wasn't just building a boat and keeping silent, but what he was doing is he was building a boat while being a herald of righteousness, that is, a proclaimer. He was warning people around them about what was to come. Fathers, God bless you whenever you build spiritual boats, because not only are you seeing your children seeing you build this, and the patience and the respect for God's authority to do things by His will and not yours, but you can do so in the midst of an evil generation, caring for them, still having a heart for them, while absolutely protecting your own at all costs. Do you see that? He absolutely protected his children. They would get on that boat, but not before helping others. And it is so easy to get wrapped up in our own lives. But let me remind us, men who build spiritual boats don't do that. Amen? We love others around us. Brethren, can you imagine the ridicule that those sons had to see towards their father, and I'm sure themselves, of these silly individuals building a boat on dry land about something that was going to happen? And let me not forget that one also. Concerning events as yet unseen. Yeah, no joke. Not only were they unseen, they're never heard of. And one of the things I want you to pick up as we go through these three examples, that all three of these men had such a faith in their God, they believed against all odds, and they were okay with that. Your children need to see you building spiritual boats, no matter the ridicule, that whatever God says He's going to do, He is going to do it, and there's no hesitation found in you. And one more thing, brethren, before I move on. God's never asked you to build a boat that He didn't first build. I seem to remember in Matthew 16, whenever Peter makes the great confession that you are the Son of Christ, the living God, and he says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. No, but my Father who is in heaven. And upon this rock," this confession, "I will," what, brothers? "I will build my church." God's never asked you to build something before He built it first. And I seem to remember in 1 Peter chapter 3, by the way, that whenever Peter reminds the brethren how God had saved Noah and his family, and he said, baptism which corresponds to this now, and He built that church, and He got you into it, in which He saved you. Ultimately, hear this: you have a good Father who built something for you. Here's another wonderful individual. The Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all the men who are seeking your life are dead." You remember that, how he killed the one Egyptian. He thought that his brethren would understand, Acts chapter 7. They didn't. "You going to hurt us too?" It's made him fearful. He fled from Egypt. He was 40 years old whenever he fled. Around this time now, it's another 40 years. Moses is about 80 years old at this point. So Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. So he takes his wife and his boys. They'd not been to Egypt. He brings them with him. Moses goes to Egypt, and you know the story. And you know the 10 plagues. And then they come out, and you remember the scene. God purposely drives them to the sea. What are you going to do? And there's this hero of faith, Moses. But the reality is, brothers, he's just like you and me. He was just like you and me. He was just like you and me. A humble servant of God. God tells him, hold the staff out. And God splits the water. And I'm paraphrasing, but he says, what are you waiting on? Tell the people to go. And did Moses doubt God one bit? No. And so they crossed the dry land. Here's what's interesting about this. We fast forward now after they've departed, after they've crossed, after they've been without water, and God provides it. And we come to Exodus chapter 18, and we read that Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people. The word has spread. And how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her home along with her 2 sons. So contrary to 1956, the 10 Commandments, whenever Moses has his wife and kids in Egypt during all of this, apparently not so. At some point, Moses sent them back home. We could speculate all day. I assume maybe just it was so dangerous he realized probably not good to have the wife and kids here. I don't know. But isn't it interesting? You know, we have a lot about Moses' sons. We have this quick little scene by the way, that when he was going to go back to Egypt, God almost killed Moses because he had not circumcised his son. There's a whole other sermon on that one. But we know very little about them. We see that instance there, and then we have Exodus chapter 18. And I think his kids, they didn't get to see their superhero dad and the 10 plagues. They didn't get to see him part the Red Sea. None of this. Brother, I guarantee you, this superhero dad was an absolute superhero to them whenever he went home. Now, his boys would end up seeing a lot of marvelous things. The commandments, his face shining, him mediating between God and his people. He was a father, if you were, to the people. But they got a real superhero at home. Brothers, can I just say this and just hear me out? You do wonderful things in this physical world, and you do really awesome, important things for everyone around us. We all play different roles, and your kids don't get to see that. That doesn't mean you're not a superhero to them, if you will. You're the biggest to them whenever you come home. So, Moses is the one that gave us this passage. You remember in Deuteronomy chapter 6 in verse 4, he begins that the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, and your strength. And everything that they've been given, he says, you're going to teach these diligently to your children. And shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. He continues to go on. You shall bind them, verse 8, as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And then he talks about the humility that they should have whenever they come into the land as he teaches the people this. And he talks about the goodness of God. And then he talks about that day whenever a son will come to the father and say, what's the point of all these? And then as a father, he articulates this. Brethren, do you know where Moses was whenever he wrote this? He was in the wilderness. For 40 years, he spends his last 40 years in the wilderness because God's people didn't have enough faith in him whenever they spied out the promised land. And what's in Moses' heart is that you teach your children this whenever you get in there. Whenever you're walking, talk to them. Whenever you're sitting, you're preaching. Whenever they're laying down, you are singing his praises. And when they wake up, you can't run from God because he's right there. Brothers, God bless you whenever you walk in the wilderness with your kids and you teach them the goodness of God all the time, the positive and the negative. Because here's the other thing. Moses wasn't the only one suffering in the wilderness. His kids were in that wilderness with them, having to wander about all the time, not having a permanent place, never knowing for sure what was going to happen, going about always. And tell me your kids don't go through the wilderness. Tell me your kids don't go through the wilderness. They go through some wilderness. And they need you there. And fathers walk the wilderness with their kids. Hear me clearly. Fathers lead that discussion. And so, in Deuteronomy chapter 1, as Paul had reminded Israel, you know, when we came out, and before you had rebelled against God, I seem to remember, and he says that he carried you as a father carries his son. And I seem to remember a Christ who spent his 40 days in the wilderness without food or water in temptation. And what did he have by him the whole time? Ultimately, whether you have a physical father or not, you are serving the Prince of Peace, who always had his father, who always gave him the bread of life, who always gave him the fountain, the waters that never gave up. He's always been walking by you, and He will carry you through anything. And we're so thankful to God for that. Sometimes you got to sacrifice a son. Now, don't get excited about this, dads. You're like, I got 3 I can sacrifice. I'm good to go on this one. This one. No, we got to. That's a cheesy joke. That's cheesy. You got to sacrifice a son. Genesis chapter 17. God promises Abraham, I will bless her, his wife, Sarah. And moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And my take on this is that he was not really laughing at God. I think he was just laughing about the reality of this. The answer is yes. No, it's not going to be Ishmael. It's going to be Isaac. And so he's already seen what God can do. Take something impossible and just make it a reality. And so God reiterates this. Yes, the blessing is going to be with Isaac. You're going to have a great nation, and they're going to have a land. And in your offspring shall all the nations be blessed. And Abraham, I'm telling you, it's going to happen through Isaac. And then we come to Genesis chapter 22. And God says, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. So he goes. Right? It was a 3-day journey. Fathers, 3 days he walks with his son until he comes to this place. This would be the future place where God's temple is built. It is called God Will Provide. He says, me and the boy will come back. And here he's going, and you know this. And he's like, Dad, where's the sacrifice? Can you imagine those words? Could you say those words? Can you hear the words whenever Abraham tells him? Could you say it, dads? Could you say it? He'll provide. And this is really a brutal scene. It's a graphic scene if you play it out in your mind, in which he now binds his son to this altar. And it's a burnt offering. So I think we forget something, that not only was he ready to slay him, but he was going to burn his son's body. So modern times now, and let's say this happens and Isaac's sitting on a couch with this therapist, and she goes, so tell me about your father. You think Isaac ever had daddy issues? You know, Abraham wasn't perfect, and I'm sure that there are some things that Isaac could probably talk about growing up, some things he wished he could change, could have seen a little bit better. But I'm going to be bold and say, I don't think actually this is one of them. How could you take your son, your only son whom you love, and put him on the altar? And I think there's the answer. I think that's Isaac's point. That's why it probably doesn't bother me as much as some other things. The fact that God asked him to sacrifice me was proof of how much he loved me. Fathers, God bless you whenever you sacrifice a son, because what you're teaching your children is that there are times where God requires the most precious thing of you, the most valuable thing to you, the one thing that most people just cannot give up. And whatever that is, we give it to the Lord. Even if that means you. And they need to see that from both sides of the coin. And what I mean is that they need to see that first and foremost that God comes before them. but they also need to see that our whole love and desire for them is to be the Lord's, that they are the Lord's. Fathers, is there anything that you wouldn't give up for the Lord? I'm going to tell you something. Isaac learned what it was to talk and what it was to walk. He walked it with his dad 3 days, and then he saw what his dad did. Instead of Isaac hating his father for the rest of his life, it actually moved him to follow his God. It molded his heart. Can I point out something else? A Hebrew writer, when it talks about his faith, speaking of Abraham's faith, it says, he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And, you know, I've read commentaries on Genesis chapter 22. Notice he says, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. Did you catch that? We're going to go, and what's implied is, and we'll come back. And all these commentators say, no, it doesn't mean that he was expecting him to be resurrected. It means that he probably was hoping that God would provide a sacrifice, or he just didn't want to tell anyone, hey, I'm going to go kill my son and come back. So, and I got to tell you, typical. Maybe one day, commentator, you'll have the faith of Abraham. I think that's the problem. They don't understand that Abraham was going, listen, it didn't make any sense for me to have him in the first place. So here's where I'm at. I've got this promised child, this miracle child, to begin with. God has promised me that this specific child is going to be the one with whom all families will be blessed, and he's asked me to sacrifice him and burn him. So I guess he's just going to raise him up from the ashes. God bless you whenever you have that kind of faith. And you know where this leads to. You know, look at the language. Genesis chapter 22, verses 2 and 5. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Your son, your only son. Whenever he goes and he's going to commit this incredible act of faith, calls out to him from a second time from heaven, Lord, because you have done and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my son. God bless you, Abraham. You are going to give me your only son, the son that you love. And I'm going to bless you. And in your offspring shall all the nations be blessed. And brethren, then we get John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Our Father carried his cross. He gave his only son for us, because that's what fathers do. But it's flipped. Do you see it this time? Do you see the power of God? Do you see the love of God? Abraham says, God, I'll give you my son. God says, no, I'll give you mine. I'll give you mine. So what is it that you're struggling with? What hole is there? What emptiness is it that you feel like can't be filled? Is his hand too short? Is he not powerful enough? Does he not love deeply enough? If you want to know how valuable you are to God, then take a look at Jesus. Abraham gave his only begotten son because that's what was most valuable, and God gave it in return. So fathers, God bless you when you build these boats, when you walk in the wilderness, and when you sacrifice a son, and let that encourage you whenever you carry your cross. He's not asked you to do anything He hasn't done and planned out before. Hope this has been an encouragement to you.